Sometimes League of Legends can be a little weird. You see, most League players have a tendency to be close-minded. With such a competitive game, and with your LP on the line in Ranked, it can be difficult to experiment and explore new ideas. For example, some players will only play one champion. Some players may play one or two variations of the same build every game, and it's kinda like, if it ain't broke, don't fix it. Why try something new when what you're doing right now is already working? What can be even weirder is the massive discrepancy between pro and solo queue. If you think that your friend refuses to try a new build or a new champion, imagine how stuck in your ways you would be if you were a pro player, as somebody whose entire career and salary is based on winning. This is why you'll see tons of professional players constantly fall back to the same comfort picks, even when they may not be that good in the current meta. This has been the case for one of League's more popular champions this season. Season 11 has been quite the ride for Senna so far. She has been ridiculously dominant with a high damage build, which actually took the player base a couple of weeks in order to accept it. It turns out though that it was just as strong as people were saying, and it would take over both pro and solo queue. But now, in somewhat of a complete 180, it looks like a new Senna build has been on the rise over the last month and a half. This time, it's been Tank Senna, a build that you've probably seen dominate your solo queue games a few times. This is a build that is now featured on her main page for websites like u.gg and op.gg, and interestingly, is also a build that pros have been refusing to take so far in competitive play. Why? What makes Senna so strong this season? What sparked her Kraken Slayer high damage build in the first place, only for her to now be building tank? What in the world is going on here if it's so good and pros aren't using it? Now, towards the end of 2020, Senna was in a decent spot as a support pick. A typical Senna build would look something like this on support, but generally speaking she wasn't seen as a very good AD carry. Of course, with the massive item rework of 2021 for Season 11, everything would change, and at the beginning of this year, she wasn't really in a good spot. As an AD carry, the three options for mythics of Gale Force, Kraken, or Shield Bow didn't really make sense on her, and after Eclipse was immediately nerfed because of how strong it was, it left her in a tough position. This made Senna players have to experiment a little bit with her builds as a support. They would start the year continuing to build Eclipse, and then after that the new Sheen item Divine Sunderer would also be given a try, and these were more or less fine, but neither were good enough to make her OP. The problem with Senna support a few months ago is that the early season support meta was controlled by Moonstone and Staff of Flowing Water enchanters. Champions like Seraphine, Lulu, Janna, and Nami would abuse this combo for free LP, but after it was nerfed, it would open up a couple of more options in the support position. Since then, we've seen the likes of Thresh, Bard, Alistar, Leona, and a few others take over the support role. Right now, it seems that support is in a fairly healthy spot, with the OP tank and engage supports being tuned down a little bit recently, which means that you can pick whichever style you prefer. However, it would not actually be support Senna that would take over February and March of this season. It would be AD carry Senna. Everything would change after patch 11.2, where a lot of different things about the champion were buffed. First off, the attack speed ratio was increased, her passive, both the gold that it granted and how often they spawned, was increased, and then on her Q, a couple of nice things. First off, heal AP ratio increased, and damage bonus AD ratio increased, as well as a very important bug fix, fixing the interaction between Kraken Slayer and her Q. All of these changes were helpful, but the key points were quite obvious. Number 1, her wraiths now granted triple the amount or near triple the amount that they did before. Secondly, increasing the attack speed ratio is insanely helpful for nearly any marksman. The wraith spawning more often on minions that she didn't kill wouldn't matter quite as much at first, but we will get back to that later. I remember when this patch first came out, and I hard abused it for some free wins. The amount of damage that you had once you scaled up was just completely crazy. The build was Kraken into Rage Blade, and then Rapid Fire Cannon and Situational after that. On 3 items and roughly 80 passive stacks, you were proccing true damage from nearly a whole screen away. There wasn't much that you could do about her once she reached her late game potential. How do you get to someone who's over 750 range away? What's also known about these interactions is that the Rage Blade math worked out very well for her. It was stupid efficient. The changes to Rage Blade this season gave it more damage on hit based on crit chance, but then you can no longer crit. Senna of course gains crit chance through her passive stacks, and when she goes over 100%, she will convert some of it into lifesteal. Even though Kraken Slayer was directly bug fixed on the patch, what's interesting is how many people would still reject this build at first. A lot of people said that there's no way that this build works for her because she doesn't do that well with attack speed. It's kind of like building attack speed on Jhin. Now, while that is true to some extent, the fact that her Q applies on-hit effects and essentially counts as an auto attack is really important. Also, her Q comes up quicker with every auto attack, so she has good synergy with attack speed. This type of build was a new style for Senna, something that we hadn't seen before on this champion. It almost seems like a Vayne or a Kog'Maw or a Varus build. On hit with extreme attack speed had never been the normal damage build for her. It was usually things like lethality. After a few weeks of testing this new setup, it turned out that she was an S-tier AD carry. And when I say AD carry, I really do mean so in the traditional sense. At the time, people were taking her in the bottom lane as the main carry with heal and a Doran's Blade start, and they would take the farm. Taking the farm gave Senna the ability to rush her core items faster. Keep that in mind. What followed next was an absolute tear on the competitive scene. The first two players to pop off were played by two of the all-time best League of Legends AD carries, Deft and Reckless. These two performances were just ridiculous. Deft finished with a score of 6-1 and 11, and Reckless finished with a score of 10-2 and 15. An interesting thing to note were the build differences. Deft would not opt for the Rage Blade second and instead went for Mirror Mana. This was a little more popular towards the beginning of this new Senna build, however it's been mostly phased out now. It seems to be a lot more efficient to just get your core and not wait on the scaling. These two games happened within just a couple of days of each other and proved to the rest of the pro scene that this build was legit. And one player who has not lost yet this season on Senna is Damwon's Ghost, who currently has a record of 7-0 with a KDA of 13.9. His best performance came on February 20th, where he clocked in nearly 1,000 damage per minute. The game went on for 34 minutes and he did 32,538 damage, finishing with a KDA of 10, 2, and 13. If you notice something weird about the champions picked here, it might be because his support, Beryl, was actually a Heimerdinger and has no support item. Senna has the support item. Why?
Senna is the first marksman designed for support, wielding light and shadow, compassion and pain. Are you afraid of the dark? Welcome to the Senna Champion Spotlight.
What makes Senna a really interesting champion is that she was designed for the support role, but also to be a marksman, a support marksman. This is mainly possible because of her passive, which allows her to gain some gold and scaling from these wraiths. An important thing to know is that they have a higher drop rate if you don't last hit the minion, which makes her good as a support pick. After Senna first came out, it didn't take too long for players to realize they could try a new type of strategy known as fasting Senna. The way that it works is that your typical AD carry player would play the Senna instead of the support. However, the support would still pick their Tahm Kench or Braum or even a mage support and just take the farm. The support player would not build a support item and instead just take the CS to get actual tank or mage items. By doing this, this allows the Senna to stack up quickly on her passive, and the support Tahm Kench would be very tanky. What made this strategy fall out of favor for a while is because Senna just received a lot of nerfs in the previous seasons since she was very overpowered for quite a while. After the changes on 11.2, it turned out that playing Senna like a traditional AD carry marksman by taking the farm was not the best strategy. The Wraiths now give 8 gold instead of 3 on pickup, and they have an even higher drop rate when you don't take CS. I have played a lot of Senna games this season, and the fasting strategy is by far better. You can reach around 100 stacks on your passive nearly twice as fast as you can by taking the CS. It's true that you do miss out on all of the gold that you're not taking from the farm, but not only does your support item supply you with income, but your wraiths give 8 gold now and the massive amount of free stats as well. The only problem, of course, is that in solo queue, it's really uncoordinated, and asking a player who never practices CSing since they main support to all of a sudden start taking the farm can cause more issues than it's really worth. In professional play, this is a non-issue, which is why if you take a look at all of the Senna games played over the last 2 months, it's almost all regular AD carry players being quote-unquote swapped into the support role. Everything seemed to stabilize for Senna. She now builds Kraken Rageblade with the fasting strategy, and even though the build was directly nerfed, it is still strong enough to see tons of picks in competitive. All of a sudden, why would tank Senna just appear out of nowhere then? Here's a quick story. About 2 months ago, I saw someone go Senna support with Grasp of the Undying. A typical Senna rune page uses Glacial Augment, but it is definitely not unheard of that she can go Grasp of the Undying. I thought it was a little off meta at the time, but I assumed it would be just fine. They would then not build Kraken Slayer, and I was pretty confused. I figured they would either have an Eclipse or a Divine Sunderer, but they didn't do that either. Instead, they built a tank item, Frostfire Gauntlet. Despite my concerns, I would be pleasantly surprised with the final result. The Senna on my team would build a super tanky setup and was not only impossible to kill, but ended up still dealing the second most damage in the game, and they finished with a score of 10, 0, and 25. This was absolutely one of those times where I was shocked by an off-meta build, and as someone who's been a huge Senna enthusiast this season, I knew that I had to try it out for myself. A couple of games of testing later, and I found out that, yeah, the build works really well. Let's start with an item change that sparked this experimentation. On patch 11.5, Black Cleaver received some very good buffs. This item at the beginning of the year was not good at all, but since then it's been in a much better spot. Just like it used to, the passive now grants movement speed, making it the perfect item for Senna in a bruiser setup. It gives her so much potential to kite, survive, and shred your armor. With the tank build also not using Glacial Augment, it means that any extra mobility helps. Coupling that with your mythic item, the synergy between Cleaver and Frostfire is great since it gives you slows on your autos. Senna has always valued the ability to slow enemies. It's the entire reason why her best rune is Glacial Augment, and it's also the reason that she used to build Frozen Mallet when that item still existed. Right now on U.GG, this is the main build for Senna support, and it has a great win rate. The damage build has not been phased off either, rather that the tank build is now just better. Right? Well, maybe not. Here's the crazy part. This build has not been played or adopted by professional players. Very few are even using the build. If you check their solo queue games by going to the actual pro play section, not a single pro is using this in their solo queue games. They're still using the damage build. On top of that, in actual competitive games, it's barely been used. Since this build became viable after the Black Cleaver buffs on March 3rd, it has seen only 3 games of play, once on March 28th, once on March 29th, and again on March 30th. All of these games, by the way, were only played in minor leagues. Not a single top 5 region Senna player has used this build yet. There's a couple of different explanations for this. Number one is that pro players are quite stubborn, and when they're paid to play this game at a professional level and their salaries depend on winning, it's going to be a lot slower to adopt things for them. However, a more likely explanation for number 2 is that tank Senna is easier to play than damage Senna and doesn't require you to worry about ruining your team comp the same way that you will if you force the fasting strategy. Tank Senna is played perfectly fine as the normal support role where you support an AD carry like a Jinx or a Caitlyn. This means that you don't have to communicate with the support to take the farm, since the damage build always works best with fasting. This is just way less of a headache for solo queue. Being tanky also allows your positioning to be a lot worse, since you're way less likely to be punished. In fact, since most players aren't used to seeing Senna so tanky, a lot of the time you can bait in an assassin or a diver who thinks that they can one-shot you, and instead they just int. Anytime that something is easier to play, it's going to have a higher win rate on average, so it's possible that the damage build is just completely superior, and pro players don't have to worry about making as many mistakes as you and I would. In high elo solo queue, Senna fasting is a very strong strategy that can still bring great results. Just in the last couple of days or weeks, Z99 in Korean Challenger has played against and with Senna Tahm Kench a bunch of times. Now, does this mean that the tank build will not see any play this season at the professional level? No, I don't think so. because I think situationally they both make sense. If the enemy comp drafts very squishy with a lot of damage dealers who want to jump on you, you can screw them over by building tanky. It's a lot less likely in professional play because assassins and divers are not as popular compared to how they are in solo queue, but if there's an enemy Nidalee or LeBlanc, the pro Senna could definitely go for a tank build and try to ruin their day. As for your solo queue games and what you should pick, if you're an AD carry main and you do trust your supports or have a duo, I recommend going the damage build. The amount of scaling and carry potential after 25 minutes is just ridiculous. Tell the support to start a Dorn's item and take the farm because you're way better off without it so you can stack faster. If you like playing Senna as an actual support and in that role, the tank build is not only viable but probably better than going the damage build simply because having two squishy AD carries doesn't really do a lot for your team comp. Anyway, this was just a really interesting topic for me that I wanted to cover today because it's very rare that a champion has a tank build and a damage build that are both totally viable at the exact same time. In other cases in the past like Tank Fizz or Tank Echo, usually it was one or the other. At the time that Tank Echo was meta and one of the best top laners in the game, AP Assassin Echo was not viable at all. They were never viable at the same time. If you enjoyed this video and enjoy the content, please consider supporting me on Patreon. If you like the editing on these videos, you can check out my Patreon for video editing tutorials. But if you don't have the funds to support the content, that's totally fine. And I appreciate you watching to the end regardless. Please leave a like and subscribe, as well as comment for the YouTube algorithm. It always helps me out, and I'll see you guys next time.